Throughout PlayStation's early years, they did not know what it felt like to lose. Their debut console sold over 100 million units, and their second console became the best-selling system of all time. But things changed during the PS3 generation. The PS3's poor reception at launch, combined with the strength of their competition, left Sony in an unfamiliar place. As the company prepared for PlayStation 4, the brand's reputation was at an all-time low. If they wanted any chance of reclaiming their throne, they would have to dig deep and perhaps get a little lucky. This is the story of PlayStation 4, and this is the story of how to save a console brand. It's no secret that the PlayStation 3 generation was a tough one for Sony. The console was difficult to develop for and launched for an absurdly high price, causing it to quickly fall behind the competition. Throughout the generation, Sony dealt with constant PR nightmares such as the infamous PSN outage of 2011. It is important to note that the PS3 did finish out the generation incredibly well. As I've covered in a previous video, the PS3 was able to turn it around in the second half of its life and eventually sold on par with the competition. But the damage was already done. The strength of the PlayStation brand had taken a massive hit. Nintendo and Microsoft got to spend the last several years enjoying their most successful generations yet, while Sony spent them desperately trying to crawl their way back. Combine that with the disappointing launch of their new handheld PlayStation Vita in the early 2010s, and this once untouchable brand now seemed quite vulnerable. With the lessons learned in the back of their minds, PlayStation began development of its next console, eager to not make the same mistakes. Development on PlayStation 4 began as early as 2007, with PlayStation still trying to process the poor launch of PS3. One of the biggest reasons for the PS3's slow start was that developers had no idea how to make games for it. This was primarily due to the Cell processor, which allowed for unrivaled power, but was also incredibly difficult to work with. This caused many games to perform worse on PS3 or even skip the platform entirely. This negative developer feedback to the Cell processor would become the core motivation behind PlayStation 4. Sony's engineers spent countless hours researching potential solutions. Meanwhile, a man by the name of Mark Cerny was hard at work on his pitch for Sony's next generation console. In 2007, Cerny was fairly unknown by the general public, but behind the scenes, he had been extremely influential to the gaming industry and the PlayStation brand. Cerny is a lifelong programmer, joining Atari in 1982 when he was just 17 years old. After a stint with Sega in the late 80s, Cerny found himself with newly formed development studio Crystal Dynamics, and it was here that his connection to PlayStation began. In 1994, Cerny visited Sony headquarters hoping to land a PS1 development kit. This would be no easy task, as at the time, Sony had only been working with Japanese companies. Cerny, however, was able to speak fluent Japanese and managed to land Crystal Dynamics their coveted PS1 dev kit, becoming the first American team to do so. Soon after this, Cerny left Crystal Dynamics and joined Universal, where he became a leading figure within Universal Interactive Studios. Cerny would quickly find himself intertwined with PlayStation once again, as Universal worked with young development teams Naughty Dog and Insomniac Games to develop Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon. Universal ended up getting into some financial trouble, causing Cerny to leave in 1998 and form his own company known as Cerny Games. Cerny would now spend most of his time as a consultant, while his PlayStation connection continued to grow stronger and stronger. Cerny had his fingerprints all over the PlayStation business, despite never being an official PlayStation employee. Cerny helped Naughty Dog and Insomniac continue to create many of PlayStation's most iconic franchises, such as Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, and Resistance. Cerny also played a role in development of both the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3 consoles. Following the PS3's lackluster launch, Cerny began researching the x86 processor. Cerny was confident the x86 would make development significantly easier, but there were concerns about how it would affect performance. Cerny spent months working on this, and eventually made his pitch to Shuhei Yoshida, the same man who had granted him a PS1 dev kit all those years ago. To Cerny's surprise, Shuhei Yoshida agreed to name him the lead designer of the next PlayStation console. Cerny was an unconventional choice, and that was not an accident. Sony had been doing things the same way since the beginning, primarily based on the ideas and principles of Ken Kutaragi, also known as the father of PlayStation. Following the struggles of PS3 and Kutaragi's departure in 2007, Sony was looking for a new direction. Cerny's ideas gave PlayStation that change they were hoping for. Sony's industry experience and history with PlayStation certainly helped as well. Still though, Cerny's career had primarily been defined by software, so tasking him as the lead designer of their new hardware was pretty risky. However, it quickly became clear that Cerny's developer-first mindset was exactly what the company needed to get back on track. He understood game development in a way that a typical hardware programmer just simply couldn't. Every choice he made with the PS4 was with developers in mind. He wanted PS4 development to be easy and approachable, with deep intricacies available for those with the necessary talent and skill to harness it. In 2012, dev kits began being sent out to developers, being referred to as Orbis at this time. Reports stated Orbis was incredibly fluid with good specs, and that Sony was doing everything they could to keep the machine as affordable as possible. At the beginning of 2013, Sony announced an event called PlayStation Meeting 2013, where they would presumably show off this new device for the first time. As we've seen throughout this series, one of the most defining moments of every new console is its initial reveal. We've seen individual consoles and even entire brands rise and fall based on these first impressions. In other words, there was a lot of pressure riding on PlayStation as they prepared for this event. The big day came on February 20th, 2013, with the system being revealed to the world for the first time. The conference begins with then president of Sony Interactive Entertainment Andrew House giving a lot of business speak that ultimately isn't all too important. But he did reveal the official name PlayStation 4 for the first time. Not really sure that was ever in question, but a confirmation nonetheless. A bit later on, House introduces Mark Cerny. Suddenly, the man who had spent most of his life behind the scenes was now on the big stage, about to show the world his creation for the first time. First, they show off the new controller, the DualShock 4. While the form factor looked pretty similar to all the other DualShocks throughout history, there were a few very noticeable differences. The first was the touchpad, which Cerny described as a new form of input. Additionally, there was a light bar on the top of the controller, described as a way to identify which player was using that controller. The light bar could also be used in tandem with the new PlayStation camera peripheral. Finally, there was a new button called the Share button, which would aim to increase social interaction on the console. Looking back now, these new features don't seem all that crazy, right? The touchpad was not used very often, especially later in the life cycle. The PlayStation camera didn't really take off, and the light bar was pretty useless until PlayStation VR came around much later. As for the Share button, this is now standard among basically all controllers. But at the time, this was pretty interesting to see from Sony, since they had made very few changes to their controllers over the years. Following the controller reveal, we get to see the system in action for the first time, starting with a variety of tech demos, primarily focused on how many particles the PS4 could handle at one time. This led into the first official game reveal, with everyone's favorite PlayStation mascot, Knack. Next, Cerny shifted focus to some of the new social features that would be found on PlayStation 4. This was really great to see. One of the biggest advantages Xbox 360 had over PS3 was its social features, turning Xbox into the de facto place for online console gaming. With online gaming growing bigger by the day, Sony had to catch up, and clearly they had taken this seriously, as shown by these new social features. To round out the show, we hear from the developers, starting with Sony first-party team Guerrilla Games revealing Killzone Shadowfall. I think this reveal was the first moment that felt truly next-gen. The tech demos were impressive to those who understood what was happening, but most probably didn't get it. Thankfully, you didn't need to be a tech wizard to understand how incredible this new Killzone game looked. The first-party reveals continued with Drive Club from Evolution Studios, Infamous Second Son from Sucker Punch, and what would eventually become Dreams from Media Molecule. Following this, Andrew House returns to the stage to confirm the console will be released in holiday 2013, and the conference ends there. All in all, I would say it was a good first showing. It starts off pretty slow with a lot of business and tech talk that may have gone over the heads of most viewers, but they end the show nicely with a lot of very exciting upcoming games. One criticism Sony received following this event was the fact that they never showed off the console itself. This was somewhat unusual, but actually seemed to have been a tactical decision. As we've seen throughout the story so far, PS4 was aiming for a developer-first and games-first mentality. The box itself was important, of course, but they were more focused on the user and developer experience. I believe Sony was hoping to back up this mission statement by not showing the console itself just yet. Whatever the reason was, there would be plenty of time for the physical console reveal at their next major event, E3 2013. Before we get to Sony's E3 showcase, there is a very important part of the story that we need to mention. PlayStation's primary competitor Xbox was also preparing for the launch of a new console throughout 2013. However, things weren't going quite as smoothly for them. I've made an entire video about the story of Xbox One, so I won't spend too much time on it here, but it has to be mentioned in some capacity. Microsoft found themselves in hot water after controversial features for their new console leaked, such as always online connectivity, the lack of support for used games, and the requirement of Kinect, Xbox's motion control device. When Xbox held their reveal event in May 2013, they did not address these concerns, instead spending most of the conference talking about television, movies, and sports. Xbox's next showing at E3 2013 was much better, with a nice showcase of games. However, the controversial policies were hanging over their heads the entire time, causing nearly unanimous negativity. On the very same day as Xbox's E3 showcase, PlayStation was preparing a conference of their own, which would take place later that night. What would ensue over the next few hours would define a generation, and ultimately change the course of gaming history. PlayStation's E3 2013 showcase began just like any other. They showed off the PS4 console for the first time and walked through all the cool new games you would get to play on it. But towards the end of the conference, Sony dropped the hammer. Then President and CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment America, Jack Tretton, walked onto the stage with a big smile on his face. Over the next several minutes, he rips into Xbox, directly calling out every controversial decision they had made. Sony put up graphics stating PS4 supports used games, doesn't need to be connected to the internet, and won't require you to check in online, causing the crowd to go into an absolute frenzy. As if this public roast session wasn't enough, PlayStation had one more trick up their sleeve. To end their conference, Sony announced the PS4 would retail for $399, which was $100 less than the Xbox One. PlayStation historians will remember 18 years earlier when Sony first entered the console market and made an immediate splash, announcing the PS1 would retail for $299, which was $100 less than the rival Sega Saturn. I think it is absolutely poetic that this new era of PlayStation was beginning in a similar fashion. While the undercut of the Saturn price was certainly significant, this Xbox jab was truly devastating. Not only had Sony managed a lower price, but they dunked on everything Xbox was doing and truly embarrassed them on what was at that time gaming's biggest stage. This moment also cemented a significant shift in how PlayStation was viewed within gaming culture. PlayStation had garnered a reputation for being pretty anti-consumer during the PS3 generation, primarily stemming from that initial $600 price point. They had become arrogant following the success of their first two consoles and seemed to think they could get away with anything. Gamers caught on to that and rejected it wholeheartedly. But suddenly the tables had turned, with Xbox being the anti-consumer company attempting to take away used games and offline play. PlayStation were now the ones giving fans what they wanted. We know that Sony was attempting to rebuild their brand with the PlayStation 4. And while they did many great things on their own to aid this cause, the reality is Xbox's blunder made things look even better than they actually were. For example, PlayStation announced during this very same E3 conference that PlayStation Plus was now going to be required for online play. This could have been a massive controversy, considering one of the largest benefits PS3 had over the Xbox 360 was the fact that you could play online for free. Instead, Sony got to slip this announcement right past everyone because we were too busy screaming at Xbox. Paying for online multiplayer is annoying, but I guess it doesn't sound all that bad when the other console is threatening to restrict your games and not function in any capacity without an internet connection. This is why I mentioned Sony needing a little bit of luck in the intro. For everything Sony did well, I think we can all agree it would not have been nearly as impactful if it wasn't for the absurdity Xbox was doing. Even the fact that Sony's conference took place after Microsoft was a stroke of luck, with reports stating that PlayStation changed sections of their event as a direct response to Xbox. About a week after E3 2013, Microsoft reversed most of the Xbox One's controversial features, but the damage was already done. You gotta give Sony a lot of credit for capitalizing on Microsoft's mistakes here when they had the chance. With the major showcases out of the way, PlayStation had put themselves in a pretty phenomenal position as they headed towards PlayStation 4's official launch. But as we've seen throughout this series, pre-launch hype is only half the battle. The PlayStation 4 released in North America on November 15, 2013, and was an immediate hit, selling 1 million units in the first 24 hours. The console launched a few weeks later in Europe and saw similar success, becoming the UK's fastest-selling console ever. Early impressions of the system were fantastic. Players loved the new UI and social features that made the PS4 feel much more connected and modern than the PS3. Meanwhile, developers were extremely happy with the design choices Sony had made, and this was shown by the games themselves. Players quickly started to notice that games on PS4 seemed to look and run better than its competitor Xbox One, which was especially impressive since PlayStation sported the cheaper console at launch. By August 2014, the PS4 had already sold 10 million units, surpassing even Sony's wildest expectations. One particularly impressive stat came from a 2014 Nielsen Media Research survey, which found that 31% of players who had bought a PS4 did not own a PS3 in the previous generation. I think this statistic is the best representation that PlayStation's goal of rebuilding their image worked to perfection, managing to draw in brand new customers who had not engaged with their prior system. For a console manufacturer, this is essentially a best case scenario. Getting buy-in from your core audience is always good and important, but what they really want to see is growth. And clearly, the PS4 had grown the PlayStation brand by a very large margin. If there is one complaint I would say about the early days of the PS4 generation, it's that first-party game output was somewhat slow. When you look back at the first several years, we actually didn't get a whole lot. Launch titles like Killzone Shadowfall and Knack were not terrible by any means and did a good job showing off what the system was capable of, but they felt a bit forgettable. The first major game post-launch was Infamous Second Son in March 2014, a game that I do really enjoy, but seemed to be received worse than its predecessors. Other staple games from the PS4's early marketing, such as Drive Club and The Order 1886, failed to meet expectations. It wasn't until March 2015 that we got what I would consider the first true system seller, which was Bloodborne. Even then, Bloodborne was not developed by a Sony first-party team, they just owned the IP. There was certainly always plenty to play, it just felt slow when compared to what we had gotten throughout the PS3 era. This slow start didn't seem to matter though, as PS4 continued to increase its lead on the competition. However, Microsoft wasn't giving up just yet, releasing some big exclusive games of their own, and cutting the price of Xbox One down to $399, making it the same price as PS4. If there was any chance of Xbox One making a comeback, it would have to happen quick. But Sony shut the door on that almost immediately. Beginning in 2016, the first-party game output we had come to expect during the PS3 generation made a comeback, with huge games hitting store shelves, including Uncharted 4, Horizon Zero Dawn, Spider-Man, and God of War 2018, all releasing within 3 years of each other. This rapid-fire string of first-party games is exactly what PlayStation players had come to expect, and the increase in must-play games pushed PS4 sales skyrocketing even further. Another major moment in the generation came on November 10, 2016 with the release of the PS4 Pro. This device marked a first for the company, bringing a mid-generation console refresh that offered more power. PlayStation is no stranger to console revisions throughout a life cycle, but it was typically in the form of a slim model, which wouldn't alter the system performance all too much, if at all. But the PS4 Pro would offer higher frame rates, better resolution, and more storage than the original. The PS4 Pro was a very compelling offer, priced at $399, the same price the PS4 had launched at 3 years prior. With this, the original PS4 console price was lowered to $299. The PS4 Pro was a somewhat risky move by Sony, but that bet paid off big time. We learned from the 2023 Insomniac Games leak that the PS4 Pro sold around 14 million units, making up a sizable portion of the console's total install base. Additionally, you would have to imagine the $100 price cut to the original model brought in a whole lot of new customers as well. Although the console was already a success either way, I'm not sure the PS4 total lifetime sales would have reached the heights it did without the introduction of PS4 Pro. Speaking of total sales, by October 2019, the PS4 had sold 102 million units, making it the second best-selling home console ever at that time, behind only the PlayStation 2. But Sony wasn't slowing down, with the console continuing to receive incredible first-party support, including Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2 both releasing in 2020. It was a stellar end to what had been an unbelievably successful generation for PlayStation, but the story doesn't quite end there. Although 2020 was technically the last year of the console's life cycle, the PS4 has continued thriving to this very day. Many brand new games are still receiving PS4 versions as we speak, and in 2024 it was reported that half of PlayStation's monthly users are still on PlayStation 4. According to the last reported numbers, the console has sold just over 117 million total units, a massive success for the brand after the struggles of PlayStation 3. PlayStation cemented themselves as the most popular traditional home console manufacturer with PS4 and has been able to carry that momentum into the PS5 generation as well. When I look back at the story of PlayStation 4, it's pretty incredible to see how quickly they were able to turn things around and ultimately save the PlayStation console brand. As we move to the present day, the choices Sony made during the PS4 generation continue to prove fruitful, with its successor, the PlayStation 5, enjoying a similar level of success. PS5 sales are currently trending slightly behind PS4, but when you consider the higher cost, Sony is making just as much money, if not even more. I think the PS5 has a lot going for it on its own, but I do think it's fair to say it wouldn't be quite as successful without the momentum boost it got from PS4. With that in mind, I hope Sony doesn't fall back into the PS3 trap, getting cocky and arrogant. Some would argue they already have, pricing the PS5 Pro at a whopping $700. With Microsoft now putting their previously exclusive games on PlayStation and essentially soft launching their exit out of the console business, Sony may soon be left without any direct competition in the traditional home console space. As we go down that path, I'm sure they will be tempted to try and push boundaries and see what they can get away with. But I hope PlayStation will instead choose to follow the trajectory of PS4 before they find themselves having to save the brand once again. I hope you enjoyed this episode of How to Save a Console. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, it helps out the channel a ton. As a quick update for those who watch this series a lot, I feel like I'm starting to run out of consoles that I can tell an interesting story about. I'm thinking of spinning off this series to cover individual games in the same style I've been covering consoles. What would you think of a How to Save a Game and How Not to Save a Game spin-off series? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.